Is my 2007 Honda Fit. It has about 185,000 miles on it. About a week ago on Saturday, my son texted me and said that he noticed a sound coming from the driver's side wheel, and it was starting to pull to the right. He was kind of concerned. He sent me an audio file of the sound, and I couldn't really tell too much, so I told him to drive it up here to Dayton from Cincinnati. I test drove it, and I noticed a grinding sound coming from the left side front wheel. We pulled it up on ramps to see if there was anything obvious from underneath, and then when I jacked it up, I realized that this wheel was loose. So let me take you all through that and take you through this repair of what I suspect is probably a wrecked bearing and or hub assembly. Using this low profile jack, we are going to jack up the car from the center, and we're going to put jack stands underneath the jack points on both sides of the car to get the front end off. I'm going to make sure the parking brake is set, and I'm going to set chocks behind it. I just wanted to show you exactly where the jack goes. There's that cross member there. And you can see it's fully supported on the two jack stands. And so we need to get this off here and figure out what's happening. Something I see that's immediately wrong right here. This should be tightened into there, but you can see it's not. And I don't know if that's because the bearing is so loose, but you can see this isn't even, I should have to get a big wrench to pull that off, and it's not even. Before I start to pull this off, I want to get this this whole caliper assembly out of the way. It takes a 17 millimeter wrench on these big bolts back here. And that one's moving. And then I'll move down to the bottom one. There it is. There's one. I'm going to get some wire before I take the other one out and then hang this. If you're smart when you put these back in, if you have to do any work on the brakes, you put some anti-seize on the threads to keep them from galling. Doesn't really matter what you hook around as long as it's sturdy, not going to come apart on you, and it's out of the way. Next, we're going to drive the disc off of the hub using these M8 by 1.25 bolts, and it's a 13 millimeter head, and that's off. Yeah, you see how that's wobbling in there. What we're looking at here is the hub, and then here's the bearing that goes on the hub. They fit inside that groove, and it goes on like this. So this gets pressed on, and then the whole assembly gets pressed onto the steering knuckle. So I've got to remove this. And I'm going to cover this up with a plastic bag so that I don't get penetrating oil all over it. Then I'm going to get the lower ball joint end off. I have a removal tool for that. Then I'm going to remove the tie rod that connects to the power steering. There's a cotter pin in there too on the lower ball joint, making sure that that bolt can't come out all the way. Here's the other side, a little better view. There's the bolt that holds the brake line on. These are the backs of the bolts that hold the strut in. And then here's your tie rod. There's your tie rod end. There's the tie rod bolt. And there is the ball joint bolt. And there's the cotter pin that we're going to remove. To remove the brake line just takes a 12 millimeter. This is the speed sensor for the anti-lock brakes. I've got a just a 3/8 inch straight bar extension, just whatever I grabbed that was handy. It has a 10 millimeter socket on it. There it is. That's That broke loose really easily. I had to replace this sensor the last time when I replaced these bearings, because what happens is that will get corrosion, that will get rusted, and it will be frozen. It'll be stuck in there, and you'll have to drive it out, and you'll destroy it in the process. And there's really no way around it. So that's probably the biggest warning right there, that if you're going to attempt this, you're gonna need some parts. One of the things that you're going to be replacing, if it has been on there for any length of time, is you're going to be replacing your speed sensor, your hub speed sensor. All right, what I've taken is I've taken the tip from a very small screwdriver and I've wedged it in there ever so gently, and it moves now. We got lucky with this. Of course, it's only been about a year. So there it is out, and in the light, you can see all the rust around that, and that's not metal, that's plastic. And then whatever's there. I just disconnected the tie rod end. That is a 17mm nut. I know there's other ways to remove tie rod ends, but I like this Pitman tie rod end puller from Harbor Freight. This takes a 19mm. You can use a box end, open end, or I just removed the locking clip for the lower ball joint. There it is. Okay, so you can see here's the nut that goes on this, and then I think really what I've done in the past is just whack it with a hammer and this falls free. So that's a 17mm nut. But before I start banging on that, I'm going to go ahead and undo these bolts here that hold the strut onto the knuckle. These are 19mm. This is what holds the bracket. So the top one holds the bracket. It's a pretty simple clip, so we're going to put that out here. And you don't want to pull this out all the way. There you go. You want to kind of leave that like that. There's the back of the bearing right there. This is the lower tie rod, or the lower ball joint. We're going to give that some wax with a hammer and see if we can bust that loose. Here's what I used to get that lower ball joint. Again, Harbor Freight. Just a very long, basically a screwdriver with an angled tip. And I whacked on the side of the ball joint until it broke loose. I wound up putting one of the bolts back in here into the strut, just to kind of hold it at a better angle so I could get some favorable leverage between the control arm here and the ball joint itself. And so I'm just going to finish that, spin that screw off. Fun fact about these knuckles, the left side, which this is the left side, is still available. The right side on the Honda, or at least one Honda website, says it's discontinued. And check that out, see if that feels loose at all. And it doesn't. Same with your tie rod end. It feels nice and tight. It moves with some resistance, so there's no slop there. This is the knuckle. The hub is seated on the ground, and you can see, or you can at least hear it, that this moves pretty freely. So let's give this a spin. That feels crunchy, for sure. And there is where the sensor pokes through. I'm using an 8mm wrench to remove the bolts that hold the dust shield onto this. It's not going to get it off entirely, but what it'll allow me to do is it'll allow me to rotate it out of the way. Okay, so that's loose. That allows me to rotate that around, and that's just 8mm. We've supported the knuckle, but we've left. I probably didn't have to get this as loose as I thought I did, because I was able to come around here and clear it, and then over here it's supporting against the part that bolts to the lower ball joint. It's supported by a motley stack of steel. Or we're going to press the hub out of the bearing first, just to get that out of there and be able to get this out of here and give us some more clearance to actually press that bearing out. I'm going to make sure on the bottom it's not binding on anything. You can see here, see the gap opening up where it's pressing the hub out. There it goes, and it's out. Let's see what we're looking at here. Oh, that doesn't look great. And I don't know to what extent the failure of the bearing. Yeah, this doesn't look good either. That is, that should not be like that. This should not be able to come out like that, and it shouldn't be bent like that. So here's the snap ring that we'll remove, and we'll press the rest of the bearing out. So let me get my snap ring pliers, and we will remove the snap ring. Okay, after much searching, I finally found my snap ring pliers, exactly where I left them. There we go. Okay. So there's no reason to keep watching me do that. So I've wiped this down, taken a look at it, see if I can figure out what happened. This appears to be undamaged. I'm going to take this over the wire wheel. I'm going to grind this down and clean this so that the sensor can have a nice mating surface. And I'm also going to run a wire brush through that to get out any rust that's in the hole there. And you can see the marks on that. That is probably a result of when this thing started to loosen. You can see chips right there along the edge. So I've got the new spindle hub and I've got the bearing. This is the same thing that I had before, and it's just the spindle hub. There's no bearing with it. I decided to go with a precision bearing instead of something like an NKS or a Timken. I'm going to press this in here and make sure that we've got the magnetic strip, which is actually the ABS sensor side is actually identified. That's going to go in towards the end that has a sensor. It's going to go in like this. We're going to press the bearing into the knuckle, and then we're going to press the hub onto the center of the bearing. Before we press the hub spindle back on, we're going to reattach our splash guard. The snap ring's also going to go on before we press the hub and spindle, and it's got a flat side and then a rounded edge. Guess which edge goes in towards the bearing? The flat, sharp edge. All right, here's my setup for pressing this bearing in. I'm going to get it started like this with a slightly oversized piece of pipe right here. That is slightly oversized just to get it going, and then I'm going to switch to an old bearing, which is exactly the right diameter, push it in the rest of the way. So before I go too much further, I spread some grease along the outside of the outer race and also the knuckle surface where the bearing is going to slide in. You notice I changed the setup on the way this was being supported here. It was because I thought it might be impacting this ceiling ring here, which I'm not going to replace. It is replaceable, but this one seems like it's in fine shape, and it's like 10 bucks, and I didn't feel like spending. So I've got good contact here. It looks like it's all the way flush. It's in plenty of room for my snap ring to fit in there. If you don't have a good set of snap ring pliers, just get a set. Don't try and use real pliers and just wind up beating the shit out of this. And there, the snap ring's in. I want to show you what I've done as far as cleaning up the hole for the ABS sensor. I ran a file through there, a round file, tried to knock as much of the excess rust off as I could, and then I took a flat file and I just ran it across the top to kind of flatten that. I don't know how much good it's going to do. If I really cared, I would grind this down to fresh bright metal, and then I would paint it, and then I would use some kind of sealant around it, but I honestly don't care that much. Just if I pull this thing out of here in a couple of years, I don't want it to be rusted in again. So I made a big mistake when I set this up. Instead of supporting the inner bearing race as I was driving the hub, as you can see, I have the knuckle supported, which was incorrect. So what I was doing was I was pressing out the inner bearing race from the bearing, and I almost ruined it. So make sure that you don't follow this setup. Support the inner bearing race when you drive the hub on. I'll make sure that's all the way in, but I'm pretty sure that's in as far as it needs to go. Before I move on, I have a bit of a confession to make. When I pressed in the hub, or the spindle hub, onto the inner race, I didn't have it properly supported, and I didn't shoot me correcting that. I noticed when I pulled it off of the press, it was very loose, and as soon as I turned it over, I could see what my mistake was. I had the knuckle supported, and what I needed to do was support the inner race. So I needed some piece of round stock that was the same diameter as the inner bearing race, and to press it that way. All right, all I did here, I just set it inside the lower ball joint and slid the CV axle inside here until the splines lined up, and then pushed it in. You can see, there it is. I would clean threads up while you're here and go ahead and coat them in some anti-seize. I've just inserted the bolts into the strut. I've attached the bracket that holds the speed sensor, and I've inserted the speed sensor in with liberal amounts of grease around it, and I've screwed it in with my 10mm socket. The tie rod end, tighten that down, and then I will go ahead and deal with the lower ball joint. As I should have screwed on the nut for the lower ball joint first, and then dealt with everything else. And that way I could have gotten to it and more easily. It's a 17mm. Yep, it is. So I've got my gear wrench, got my 19mm wrench here, and I've got my 19mm impact socket. Don't forget the safety clip on the lower ball joint nut. Slides in and locks onto the nut. It's a castle nut. Don't forget to reattach the brake hose. Here's where we're going to put the caliper and the brake disc back on. Before you do that, make sure the disc is completely clean with brake cleaner. It's got to be totally spotless. Give it one last spin to make sure that everything moves freely and nothing's binding. All right, this gets torqued to 165 foot-pounds. I've already done that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this punch here, and I'm going to set that. All right, we're going to make sure that can't back out. That's not going anywhere now. So that does it for this repair. Now, it's not the only way that you can do this. You don't have to pull the entire knuckle off and take it to a press. If you've got the right toolkit, you can do this without ever removing the knuckle from the car. And as you saw, you've really got to be careful, pay attention to what you're doing when you're pressing these bearings in and out and when you're pressing the hub back on. There's several videos of guys doing this same repair. I suggest you watch them all. If you enjoyed what you see, consider leaving me a thumbs up, a comment, or subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.